Welcome back. We're going to have Tarun Nagesh speaking to us now. Tarun is joining as curator of Asian art at the Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane. And he is part of the lead curatorial team of the Asia Pacific Triennale of Contemporary Art, a model that is very familiar to the audience here. Also, Maud Page, who joined us in the previous edition of the Curators Hub, spoke about APT, and Tarun will also share his perspective and his curatorial experience on this model. His role also has involved very close work with South Asian and Southeast Asian artists and through the 7th, 8th, and 9th editions. And he regularly curates exhibitions at QA Goma. Recent projects include Problem Wisdom, Thai art in the 1990s, A Fleeting Bloom, Japanese art from the collection, and Kalpavriksha, Contemporary, Indigenous, and Vernacular Art of India, which was part of APT 8. Tarun is also actively involved in commissions and acquisitions for the QA Goma collection and oversees QA Goma's historical Asian art collection and exhibitions. So these are also some of the elements of his practice on which we can ask him questions. And yeah, really looking forward. Thank you, Tarun.
Thank you for rushing in after lunch. Firstly, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Experimenta, to Pratik and Priyanka, and the team for putting up with us. Calcutta's been a city I've been really desperate to come back to in recent years to learn a little bit about the arts scene. And a lot of that has had to do with the fact that there's this amazing dynamic gallery here, Experimenta, who I've been really lucky to work with some artists and speak to Priyanka and Pratik quite regularly in developing shows. I also wanted to thank the Australia Council for the Arts. Fantastic that they're involved in this project, and for supporting my travel to speak here. Australia Council have been a huge supporter of APT since its very beginning, so they've been really fundamental in growing and developing the APT. I also want to thank the Australian Consul General in Calcutta, recently established, and fantastic to have them here in Calcutta actively now. So hopefully you'll see many more Australians coming to future events here. So I thought I would mainly focus on the Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art. It's kind of the biggest exhibition we do at the Queensland Art Gallery. We all regularly do other projects, but I thought this is really the basis where we ask lots of big questions about curatorial approaches, where we kind of question exhibition models and paradigms, but also I think it's an interesting exhibition to consider, how we create regional dialogues and concepts of regionality. So, very quickly, just to show you where we are, you may have heard of the APT, but I'm sure very few of you have actually been to Brisbane. So these are the two gallery buildings on the south bank of Brisbane, which are just in the centre of the image there. So Brisbane's a city located on the Brisbane River. This is known as Maiwa, the river in the Indigenous language. And this area is home to two Indigenous groups, the Turrbal and Jagera people. So we always like to acknowledge them when we talk about this place and acknowledge their ongoing connections and custodianships of these lands, which really underpins everything we do at the gallery as well. So very, very briefly, just some background on APT. I couldn't think of an appropriate slide to use, so I thought 25 years of exhibition catalogues is also an interesting thing to look at. So the APT began in 1993. It was conceived as 3 exhibitions in the beginning, and it really brought in a lot of advisors, a lot of co-curators from all around the region, although, mind you, it was a smaller part of the region than we engage with now. And so, the conference and the exchange that happened became a really important part of the event, where the skills and the expertise weren't necessarily in this institution at all. at the time. In 1996, began showing South Asian artists, so there weren't any South Asian artists in the first edition, but the second edition started including Indian artists, and just some of the Indian artists we showed in those first couple of APTs, including Nalini Malani, Mrinalini Mukherjee, Nilima Sheikh, Rumana Hussain, and Rimzon, Vivan Sundaram also involved, and a lot of critics and curators active at the time from India. And in 1999, that started to include Pakistani and Sri Lankan artists also. And Pakistan particularly has had quite a big place in the exhibition ever since. Since 2002, the APT kind of had to really changed its model, and it became more of an in-house generated exhibition with using the curatorial work of the curators there primarily. And while it's a continuing exhibition over more than 25 years now, it's changed really significantly edition to edition, not only through staffing and budget and institutional change, but also as parts of the region and our relationships with it have changed so much. And the fact that I'm always reminded of, 3 years working on a triennial in such a dynamic part of the world, enormous change happens, not only with practices, but also with social and political contexts. So it is a model that we continue to question, we continue to experiment as much as we can within. Another important factor of the APT is Australia's very much part of the exhibition. It really developed at a time when Australia was for the first time starting to think of itself politically, economically and culturally as part of the Asia-Pacific region, where for a very long time before that it was really seen as having these strong connections to Europe and America. I think the APT is also really interesting to consider in terms of trans-regional exhibition frameworks developing at the time. In the 90s, exhibitions like the Asian Art Biennial, the Fukuoka Art Triennial, Asian Art Triennial, that were operating at that time and creating these exchanges that at the time weren't happening, so much around the world. As well as it was a time where a lot of experimental contemporary art platforms were developing, particularly in Southeast Asia. Sorry, I can't remember. Just a second. So I was thinking when I was invited to speak at this and kind of really question curatorial models and approaches, I was just thinking about some of the big questions that arise when developing an exhibition like the APT. One of which I constantly think about is, how we kind of present and compare and select artists working in very different contexts to represent in an exhibition alongside each other, but maintaining a platform that gives voice to a diversity of practices. Particularly where artists from parts of the region may not have access to studios or materials or be making art in political, environmental or economic struggle, and sometimes under serious censorship and different forms of censorship. So kind of thinking about how can we represent art from these contexts with respect and integrity, keeping in mind we're a public institution, so we're very audience focused, and it's a free exhibition, so we have a large and diverse audience. And how we can maintain that integrity when we're taking practices out of context and putting them in a different context, particularly when you might be taking artwork from a context that doesn't have big art galleries like we have in Australia. Also, how do we deal with subjects of political sensitivity and trauma in a contemporary art exhibition in a meaningful and, again, respectful way? And for me, APT, we often get comments on that the APT is a very political exhibition, sometimes as a criticism. Sometimes, it is seen as this platform where people do come to kind of learn about the politics of the region as well. It's talked about in that way. For me, I believe working with contemporary art in the Asia-Pacific region is kind of inherently political, thinking about, what is happening and what has happened in the region and its relationships to contemporary art. And not saying that necessarily manifests in a very kind of singular and very overt political statement, but often through representing artists working with political issues, which is also a significant part of the exhibition. And it's a chance for us to kind of think about political contexts and where histories can be explored. And so it also becomes a platform for our audiences to learn about these concerns and to open up discussions. So also there's the consideration of working with Asian and Pacific art in Australia, which also has its own social and political implications. And recognising the diversity in our Australian community and how to kind of access and engage that. And I guess lastly, you know, how can we represent these in an public institution? How can we remain experimental and continue to question embedded values and biases in a museum as well while we're doing this? So just a couple of things on that very particular APT model before I start with some more interesting slides. So the APT is largely an in-house curatorial team with guest curators coming in to often work on quite focused projects within the larger exhibition. There generally isn't one overarching theme. I think one of the reasons is it's such a kind of diverse region and, you know, quite broad region that we do cover. So I think imposing one theme, and we have a number of different curators working on it, would be a little bit unfair and maybe a bit disjointed. But it is an exhibition that has these, you know, quite strong multiple thematic narratives, which we then very kind of deliberately highlight through the exhibition displays. We have different spaces, so we can set these up, you know, quite coherently sometimes. And then, you know, further through our discursive platforms, through our catalogue writing, public programs, that kind of thing. It's an ongoing exhibition, so kind of one exhibition might inform the next. So we do kind of think about it as having those kind of relationships between editions. It's also linked to our collection, so we do collect a lot of work for our collection through the APT. So this may impact the selection of works at times, and, you know, those works are considered in broader museum activities as well. And so I think, you know, this collecting from a Biennale type exhibition, it can be considered maybe problematic in certain contexts, but I think it also gives us opportunities as well. On a similar note, the APT is now kind of 25 plus years old and has undergone big transformations and lots of different stuff, including some in this room that have been involved before. But so I think it has come to a point where we can start thinking about the exhibition art historically. It is now, you know, really a generation, you know, a generation between the beginning and the beginning of the APT and now. And many artists are kind of thinking about those generational influence as well, keeping in mind that, you know, some of those artists that were showing in the 90s in certain countries, that was kind of at a time when contemporary art from some of those contexts was only just starting to be internationalised. So I thought I'm going to focus on some projects from the past two APTs, mainly focusing on artists from South and Southeast Asia that I've been working with, but also speaking about some other projects alongside these, just to add some context, acknowledging that, you know, some of these projects my colleagues were working on, but I thought it would also might be interesting to think about how some of these artists that you might be familiar with are contextualised in, you know, in that forum in Brisbane, you know, amongst other artwork from the Asia Pacific region. So I'm going to start with the most recent exhibition. So this is the 9th APT, which opened late last year and just closed in April earlier this year. And so I just thought I'd walk through some of the projects and really pick out some of those strong thematic threads, if you like. So just firstly, wanted to talk about an artwork that was really placed quite deliberately. Right at the beginning of the exhibition, it was directly opposite the kind of sponsors and supporters signage. And it's an artwork by quite a young Indigenous Australian artist from one of the Central Australian communities by the name of Vincent Namatjira. And it's actually these portraits, 3 different series of portraits of 7 figures. And the very top you have the 7 recent prime ministers at the time that he painted them. You probably all know we go through prime ministers very quickly, but at the time, the 7 prime ministers. The bottom row is the 7 wealthiest people in Australia, and the middle row is the 7 elders and artists, senior artists from Vincent's community. So it was already setting up one of the big thematic threads of the exhibition, and this was ideas of wealth and power, and how artists can negotiate and can kind of present different ideas about power and can question our power relationships and play with forms of value, really. Also placing an Indigenous Australian artist at the beginning of the exhibition also kind of signalled that, you know, Indigenous art is a big part of this exhibition. And you know, Australian voices are really central to discussions from other parts of the Asia-Pacific region as well. Similarly, also placed at the entrance to the exhibition were these incredible big rings, which are called tutana. They're from a group of people called the Tolai people in East New Britain, in kind of far eastern part of Papua New Guinea. And these are actually constructed from shell money. So they're kind of threaded with these tiny little shells that are actually a usable currency in East New Britain amongst the Tolai people today. So you can actually pay for things with these rings. And they're constructed into these incredible large, almost like bank, you know, they act almost as like banks, this collection of money. Objects with, you know, enormous cultural value, enormous cultural meaning, they feature in ceremonies and things like that as well. So again, you know, placing objects like this at the beginning of the exhibition to kind of signal that questions of cultural value will arise throughout the exhibition as well in different ways. I wanted to briefly talk about including Rashid Arain in this exhibition. For a number of reasons. He was one of the first artists that kind of I was involved with for this edition, invited quite early. And I think, you know, through Rashid, there's, you know, clearly these questions of power arise. You know, many of you will be very familiar with Rashid, a long history of really kind of challenging dominant narratives in the art world. You know, particularly Western hegemonies that operate in the art world through his artwork over a very long period of time and through an enormous publication output. But I mean, one of the things that I was really interested with Rashid was, you know, he was asking a lot of these questions, you know, in the 70s and 80s of, you know, the place for non-Western artists in these dominant discourses. And you know, acknowledging that there's been this kind of very big recent interest again in Rashid's work. And for me, it was kind of thinking about, well, all those questions that he asked back then, you know, what do they mean now? And I still think a lot of them haven't necessarily been addressed or addressed adequately. Just, you know, very quickly, we included works from different parts of Rashid's career. So from the 1950s in the front here, the sculpture, more recent of his abstract works, which he's kind of returned to at different parts of his career. But on the left here, these works from the late 80s and early 90s, known as they were called his cruciform works, where he placed images and symbols from the Western world against images and symbols and artworks from the Islamic world. In this kind of tension that he could continually kind of experiment with and play with. This was really at a time where there was the US militarized occupations in various parts of the Gulf, and Rashid was very kind of confronted with how that played out in the global media, and himself coming from an Islamic country, but living in London, so kind of noticing the racism and the perceptions that was building. And just on the opposite side, sorry, can't see it very well, but just wanted to show what we placed next to Rashid's work, which was a work by Burmese artist Soa Wongsi, who his family was exiled a long time ago from Myanmar. But it's, sorry you can't see it, but it's a big diagram, and he has actually researched heavily a lot of the events, power structures, organisations, global companies, nations that have been involved in different ways in the situation in Myanmar today and in recent history, and really mapped these out and connected them. So, you know, again, these kind of, you know, the way that artists can construct these power relationships and allude us to these power relationships, that I think in a way sometimes artists can only really grab our attention to some of these issues in a certain way that's very different to, you know, what you might read in a book or news headlines. The other thing I want to say about Rashid was we also were really quite interested in looking at non-objective practices that are present in the Asia Pacific, and we included, you know, really thinking about how, I mean, as Rashid was always kind of advocating for artists from non-Western backgrounds to be accepted into and part of the discourse around practices such as this in that dominant discourse, but thinking about how artists use non-objective art in different ways in the region, and sometimes that these are very closely aligned or in dialogue with practices in, you know, the big art centres of the world, but how sometimes these evolve completely exclusively of them as well. So sorry, I'm just losing myself a little bit. And you know, how you can kind of counter Western-centric readings of art history in the process. And so Rashid was a very big, prominent voice to this discussion. So some of the other, you know, more senior artists or deceased artists that were part of that conversation were Hassan Sharif, so of course a great pioneer and hugely influential in the UAE for conceptual art, and also Roberto Chabet, so someone who was hugely influential in the Philippines and really remained in the Philippines and really kind of dedicated himself to the development of conceptual art in the Philippines, and a great mentor to many. But these were, of course, in dialogue with a lot of younger artists, including Ayesha Sultana, so Bangladeshi artist, who shows here at Experimenta, and you know, some extraordinary works that we included in the exhibition from her, made of graphite. If any of you have seen these, I mean, the pictures don't really do them justice. They've got this extraordinary kind of tactility to them, and they, you know, look very kind of machine-made from a distance, and then you get close and they've got this, you know, beautiful handmade texture to them. And so thinking about some of these, you know, abstract processes and how you can kind of talk about them or think about them either in, you know, big kind of global contexts or in very local ones. You know, Ayesha always talks about how, you know, she, you know, her observations in Dhaka and the architecture and life and the smells and the sounds of Dhaka really informed these works. In kind of another approach to this, Handi Werman Samputra, so an Indonesian artist, part of the Jendela group, so part of a group that really resisted, you know, this dominant in Indonesia and Yogyakarta specifically, very kind of politically driven artwork to make abstract work and conceptual art, which, you know, I found is kind of such a unique kind of form of abstraction for him, really coming from quite a different place, and you know, he's Sumatran and gets a lot of kind of inspiration from the language and the phrases of the Minangkabau people. Waqas Khan, so Lahore-based Pakistani artist, and I was, always quite interested how that his work so often talked about having these relationships with these, big, very well-known European and American abstract artists, which I kind of never really understood or never found the kind of evidence for, but beautiful works that I think come from a different place altogether. And then so kind of thinking about some of the links of these non-objective practices you can construct in different parts of the Asia Pacific. So Ayesha Sultana was placed against two sisters, two artists from the Northern Territory in Australia, whose works, and they are very much related to knowledge and stories and a sense of place and ceremony from their communities, but of course have this incredible abstract quality to them as well. So kind of another kind of consideration, particularly around the South Asian artists included in this exhibition, was thinking about language and poetry, which also relates back to Rashid in a sense, this enormous kind of publishing voice who also used Urdu in his works at different times in different ways to make political statements. And how language and poetry is deployed in South Asia, and also thinking about the border tensions at the time, and kind of thinking about how language influences, informs so much artwork in South Asia in different ways, and how that is related to those regional tensions and histories as well. So Shilpa Gupta's work, which many of you will be familiar with, was showing in Kochi at the same time. Also artists like Niza Khan, who this ongoing series of work called Heavenly Ornaments is really underscored by her reading of a text called Heavenly Ornaments that was this kind of moral lesson and social obligations that were placed on young Muslim women in Pakistan, and kind of her reaction to that, grabbing from different points in history and different contexts these garments, and kind of reconstructing them, garments that at different, sometimes were considered ideals of beauty, but at other times really restricted the female body and contained it, or protected it, you might say. Mithu Sen, of course, language and poetry, and really challenging language and deconstructing language, such a big part of her practice, in very kind of playful ways sometimes. She of course, she's studied at Shantiniketan. She really calls herself a poet. I think poetry is such a huge part of her practice and really underpins all her works. And her talking about, moving to Delhi, and that she kind of lost this association with Bengali when she couldn't speak Bengali so often there. And so kind of really deconstructing, language, how language operates in response to that. Even artists like Munem Wasif, we presented this, amazing film that he shot in Old Dhaka, but this film, he describes as being this piece of disjointed verses or broken poems, which I understand is this kind of filmic device, and really, again, informed by literature and informed by poetry. So just thinking about some of the other South Asian artists and in what context they were presented in this show. So Aisha Khalid, which was this incredible, really large-scale commission, specifically for APT9, and a few connections that this built. One being, there's kind of weaving practices really explored and highlighted and connected throughout different parts of the exhibition, and thinking about how weaving informs contemporary practice in so many different ways in different places today. But there was also a number of works that really highlighted expressions of spiritualities and drawing from spiritual language, spiritual art forms, religious art, but that could still make quite profound social and political commentary. So Aisha Khalid, and again, connected to language in such a strong way. The title of this work is "Water Has Never Feared the Fire." So it's a piece of text borrowed from Rumi, and really constructed with a lot of Persian imagery based on the Charbagh Gardens and symbols that really appear in many of the kind of big Islamic texts. And 5 minutes. Oh, okay, I have to rush. Sorry. But so thinking about religious objects and spiritual objects deployed in different ways, a work by Vuthlina, Cambodian artist, built out of these shrines which were taken from a very famous building called the White Building in Phnom Penh that was very controversially knocked down a couple of years ago and kind of displaced these communities. A work by Hatain Lin, which is an artist from Myanmar who was political prisoner for many years, really about his association with Buddhist art. And so this is all made out of alms bowls, and very significantly these alms bowls are turned upside down. And this has become, over many different points in history in Myanmar, a symbol of protest that monks have actually used, because refusing alms refuses the kind of the alms giver this spiritual merit, and it's been an action that monks have carried out against all their military dictatorship at different times in these big protest movements. But also a very personal story of his associations with Buddhism and how Buddhism has been instrumentalized in Myanmar today. I might race through a few of these. Lao artists shown in the exhibition for the first time. This artist from Luang Prabang, a Hmong woman, Chu Song, and really reinterpreting Hmong spiritual characters and figures and stories. Again, an artist from Laos who has collected these these bombs and parts of bomber planes that still litter the landscape in Laos and turned into these planters. So, conveying this story, this history in the exhibition in quite a simple gesture, but one that I think is still quite profound and you can convey a lot to audiences. Ali Kazim, so these renderings of the Punjabi landscapes of, in and around Lahore, and him looking at the histories of the Harappan empires and those ancient empires. He collects a lot of pottery shards from these areas. And this was shown along even, artists, jewellers, and Indigenous artists from Australia and New Zealand who, do these ancient practices of collecting shells and materials and making jewellery from them. So I might quickly skip through I want to briefly say another focus project was called Women's Wealth in this exhibition, which brought together in a workshop model, quite a different model, artists from the Solomon Islands and Bougainville and Indigenous artists from Australia to look at different women's practices, but also thinking about that context of making, how knowledge is transmitted in those forums, thinking about weaving circles, thinking about those exchanges, thinking about the cultural value of those objects. So I'm going to race through. I just wanted to very briefly talk about another focus project curated with one of my colleagues, Abby Bernal, and Minaz Majumdar, Delhi-based curator, which brought together Indigenous vernacular practices in India. Sorry, I'm going to have to race. Just got a couple of minutes, right? Just some precedents for this show. So Sonabai, who showed in 1999 in the third Asia-Pacific Triennial, through Jatindra Jain working with her. So there were these kind of precedents. Of course, Indigenous art and kind of artworks from non-mainstream contemporary practices have always been a part of APT. Also wanted to mention these exchanges between Indigenous artists and Australian Indigenous artists and Indian Indigenous artists, including Jambal Marawili and Gunabi Ganaba, who studied under Jambal Marawili, but also Janga Singh Sham being one of the other artists, and Janga Singh Sham's nephew Venkat was included in the show. So you have these kind of generations of Indigenous practices from both places. So sorry, I'm going to skip through these. So Kaligat painting, Patachitra scrolls, Warli paintings, Gond art, Mitila art, and just some of the other projects from South Asian artists. Asim Waqif, really thinking about some of the non-white cube practices that were emerging from India at the time. Prabhakar Pashpute, another great artist, shows it experimenter. So can I just say a couple of words to just summarise them, and I'll flick through the rest. So I guess and one of the things that I've really thought about, and I think it's become quite important to working on the APT more recently, is thinking about these trans-regional relationships and the changing power structures in the region and how they manifest both inside and outside of the art world. How these resonate with other histories and social movements. We think a lot about how the Pacific is viewed, for example, as a periphery, but is now becoming kind of this centre of power plays around the region. Similarly, seeing Brisbane or Australia as this periphery of various regions, but you can have a central discussion about certain art practices. Indigenous links throughout Australia, the Pacific, through Taiwan and the Philippines and elsewhere. But also, how the exhibition platforms can have these dialogue with big social and political movements. So thinking about something like the non-aligned movement, thinking about Tagore's and Shantiniketen's relationships that constructed, which really didn't rely on kind of a Western legitimation or kind of centering, and how these kind of shift our perceptions and how we contextualise art practices as well. So sorry, I had to race through that little bit at the end, but I might leave it there. I'll flick through the rest of the slides anyway. I had a lot.
Thanks, Tarun. It was also great that you started with just mentioning APT, the second and third editions as well, because one of the really one I sort of also just realized even more the personal significance that this model holds was when working with Nilima Sheikh, and she mentioned when we were just discussing for Documenta 14 and as the kind of commissioning opportunity for her as an artist who has also taken very conscious breaks in making work and then sort of reading and doing a lot of other activities that have to do with teaching or being part of activism practices and all of this. But for her, at that point, she said, there's this work I did in the second APT, and that was very important for me. And I want to use that as a reference for what I do for Documenta. And that was just really special to have her kind of cycle back to that point. Between that point and then more recently another large-scale work that she then eventually did.
I've got a photo, that's why I'm racing through this.
And and as someone who took all these sort of, that one. Yeah, so just that, it's just more an anecdote, but it was also to stress on the fact that APT in that sense, of course, it's a museological triennale, which is quite different from, say, one that is really going into public spaces and engaging with social context outwards in that sense. Here it seems more that it's that the institution, that the facade that we see is what holds all of this in it. And yet the kind of commissioning practice that it generated in the 90s was absolutely in that sense, novel and has so much value even today. And so, also in India, a lot of those works didn't show, so they just stay with us as these images. And so, what I'm just thinking about in this rather roundabout way is how to bring those, what to do with those gaps, right? That here we are sitting, and we still haven't seen those works. And for the artists, they're still very vivid, and they're still referencing those works they did at APT in their current practices, especially the older artists. So, what do we do with the gaps in that sense? I know that there's a library and archive. Perhaps you could just highlight that in QA I went and I saw that there's a archive on APT that is accessible.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe if you
absolutely.
could
And I think that does pick up some really important considerations for us as working on the APT. I mean, of course, most of us that work there, started working at the gallery a long time after this period in the 90s, which is still talked about as being quite influential. And one of these very rare platforms where artists were doing big commissions. I mean, particularly from places like Southeast Asia. Many artists, I know from when I travel around and meet some of the more senior artists, or even the younger artists that were influenced by those senior artists showing, and it was sometimes the first times they were asked to commission a major work and show it in an international context, sometimes in dialogue with works from their neighbouring countries that they actually don't exhibit in their own country. So I think there is that incredibly important history. And it's kind of something we need to continue thinking about, because what do you do with that? APT doesn't serve that same function now at all, but I think it is. There is a big archive. I think it's a big part of what we do working now with the APT. We've got that distance of time to look back and think about what was happening then. We often even think, developing our conferences and things like that, like look back at those old papers. There's like some of the things that Gita Kapoor said at the time, have great relevance now, are really interesting to revisit. But I mean, Nilima's a really interesting example, and I was going to go on to about that because it hadn't been shown for a very long time before I put it in this show a couple of years ago called The Long Story. So it was this chance to kind of revisit that work and try and mine and find information about it. I found there was very little, and actually was able to speak to Nilima and actually record all this information about it. And then was able to construct a show around it, and you can see with Warli paintings, with textiles from Kutch, with works from other parts of the Asia Pacific, and really recontextualize them because they're in the collection, which I guess you don't get to do.
Do you want to talk a little bit about The Long Story?
Since I'll touch on it. Yeah, I can touch on it very briefly. So I was just going to mention this, which was a collection exhibition that happened in between those two APTs that I spoke about briefly. It was called The Long Story, partly, as a response to, constructing these massive, blockbuster exhibition, and that it's often a very quick consumption of an artwork placed in an international context that that sometimes loses the stories, the slower stories that you want to tell about them. So we were really looking at different parts of the collection and taking works out and really thinking about, what other stories we'd like to tell. And so really focused on, the different ways artists engage with history, from creation stories, from, textile artists starting to turn to narrative textiles. There's a section that really looked at conflict in the region, and the way that artists have responded to conflict, or actually created, really began to write those histories of conflict through art, as well as how conflict might influence contemporary art in different parts of the region, including historical objects, and thinking about kind of propaganda and how that might function in Japanese war prints, next to kind of Chinese, political pop art. looking at public representation and how artists in Asia and the Pacific, use the body and use the public to make, quite bold political statements at times as well. Yeah, so I guess, having this collection, you get to, and collecting from an exhibition like that, you can really start exploring different contexts and set up different dialogues with those works as well.
And can you share a little bit more about this sort of methodology of having a kind of project exhibition within the Triennale, where there was, this time you said, you shared Kalpavriksha as an example, of course, but also Women's Wealth.
Yeah.
But when did that begin? Was it this sort of...
That's... I mean, that's been kind of more recent part of the exhibition, but, for at least the past 4 or 5 editions. I think, an exhibition the size of APT, and that's got many different gallery spaces, kind of does give you the chance to, and, we kind of acknowledge that sometimes you can only work with a couple of artists from, a certain context or a certain country, but so we do try and develop these focus projects that allows a slightly more focused look at a particular region, context, idea, type of practice. And that's often where then we'll bring in external advisors, co-curators. So I did want to mention that Women's Wealth Project, which was quite a different exhibition model, which was a kind of almost an exhibition within the APT, that my colleague developed, Ruth McDougall, along with an external co-curator, Sana Balai, that could really, that enabled them to do this incredible workshop in Bougainville, bringing artists from the Solomon Islands across, which has this long history of exchange, and they're located very close to each other, and their art practices, have such connections over history, but has been divided by this national border for so long, which has stopped this exchange. So it's, it's a real chance to kind of, through a triennial, having that time, that 3 years, with those focus exhibitions, to try and really almost like develop a very specific exhibition within this huge kind of regional, expansive exhibition.
Great, thank you. Are there questions in the audience?
Thanks, Tarun. It's nice to see some of the works again. For those of you who don't know, I also had the pleasure of working on the APT for a number of years also. I guess I was curious, since I left in 2006, there's been quite a shift in definitions of the Asia Pacific within the project, quite markedly towards the Middle East. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the decisions to include the idea of a Middle East and an Asia. And then secondly, one of the big reasons I left was this frustration in commissioning projects with communities across Southeast Asia and realizing they're not being seen back home. And so I went and picked myself up and took myself over there. But I was just wondering, to what extent do you think an APT in 2000 and when's the next one, 2021?
End of 21.
Yeah. To what extent can we think about 2021 as an APT vision outside of Australia? Is it possible to, in knowing the vast networks that have been built over 25 years of the project, do you think the Australian people and its government are at a time and place where they can identify the need to take what they're doing beyond the nation's borders?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think I knew Zoe was going to ask a hard question because she was involved in APT before me anyway. But a very, very important, a couple of things there. I mean, one is, how you define that Asia-Pacific region. I think this is something that we continually ask ourselves. I don't think it's up to us to define that region necessarily, but I think it's for us to consider how we can more meaningfully engage with it, what our strengths are, what our opportunities and possibilities are. I think, it was some time before Middle Eastern countries, West and Central Asia came into the APT. I think more recently we've kind of probably thought more about what is our kind of core geography dictated by the access and our knowledge of those contexts, as well as the history of APT. So I think we've kind of collectively thought that maybe we should put more focus on those places that the APT has that long history with. We've got the greater networks, the greater knowledge for, and that art from kind of the further expanse of that region perhaps needs to really have dialogues with that kind of core or closer geography. I think the other really important question you ask, about these big commissions that don't get seen at home, which is I think it's a huge question, and I was going to just mention that briefly with an artwork like Lino's, which I showed up here. So this huge tower, which has such a local connection. I mean, it's about people's domestic shrines, so it's the spirits of their houses from this building in this community that's been completely displaced. But I think, and taking responsibility of that, which...
I don't mean to interrupt you rudely, but I just want, this is a really good example, because when I was in Phnom Penh before it was shipped, no one would enter the gallery space where it was being stored.
Yeah.
And it was quite marked as that, why is there not anyone going inside? And they're like, there's at least 100 dead people in that room, and I don't want to go anywhere near it. And then we see it in a nice fancy white cube space, and it's appreciated for very different reasons. But how do we get those stories back into the gallery exhibition space is what I'm still left questioning.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I had, hesitations about this. We had a lot of conversations. I think,
I think it's great you got it in there.
Consultations like the kind of key to that, and consulting not only with that artist but with other people from that context. I think, for this work specifically, there's a lot of conversations with Lino about this. When I first kind of heard about it, when he first kind of proposed it, I didn't even really think it would be the kind of thing that someone would collect. I didn't think he'd want to even kind of part with it. But in the end, he said, "Look, I've got no way of storing this. I can't present it." He did actually build it and show it to the local community as best he could, but he said it's survived there. And through, he already had connections to the gallery, knew we had a Cambodian collection. So it was really quite comfortable with passing that over. But that custodianship is something to be taken very seriously as well. And I think with a lot of the works that we commission and collect, especially out of Pacific communities, maybe even more so. And many of those, that custodianship again is something that sometimes has to be passed over, and it's actually a great responsibility for the institution to take them. I think it's something we take quite seriously now and still are perhaps learning about. But that responsibility has to be conveyed to everyone as well. Just what you're taking into. But related to that, and with a project like this, that it has done that in one sense, but it was very much constructed. Brought these different artists together in the region. So it wasn't a matter of just going around and commissioning each one of them and collecting their works and taking them away. But the important thing was that this workshop was held in the region so that artists could have this exchange there. So when you're talking about taking that out of Australia and back to the region, I think that's one of the ways we're at least attempting to do so. Yeah.
There's a question at the back. Okay, speak in. Just put
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Tarun. My question comes out of a curiosity concerning positionality with regard to representation. Um, there is kind of a debate that's been going on within the cultural critics and artists trying to tell stories of non-native artists coming into other areas and trying to tell stories of, let's say, a native community. It can be an indigenous community or otherwise. And there are semantic criticisms that's going on about who has the right to tell whose story. Um, and there's this whole power shift between, for example, the African world and the American and Eurocentric world going in and telling stories, and there's a process of reversal of that happening. Uh, how do you see, when you look at works for collections or for exhibits, how do you look at, what are the factors that go on at your end with regard to selecting what works? Is there a preference for native artists telling native stories? That's something that's always been there. But how do you look at non-native artists telling stories of other communities and the politics and decisions
I
behind
don't
it?
think we'd normally include them in the exhibition, to be honest. I think, I mean, you're talking about really cultural appropriation, right? I think, and you know, coming from an Australian context, I think we have still a lot to learn about representing Indigenous artists from our own country, for starters. But it is something that galleries, institutions, the art market has. Indigenous art plays quite a big role in Australia, and that manifests in many different ways. You know, it's not traditional art all the time. It's very contemporary often. There are artists working very much in urban contexts, confronting political contexts, working with all kinds of materials. There are other artists working in communities, telling stories that are really particular to that community. So I think the important thing is understanding and respecting the protocols around them, also how those artists identify themselves, and respecting all of that. But I think if it came to an artist from outside those contexts stepping into those, I can't really think of an example where that's happened, apart from where perhaps an artist has a very strong link to that community and has been accepted into, and that community has maybe said, given them the rights, given them the copyright to do so. But I still can't really think of an example where we have included a work like that, or why we would need to. It's kind of, it has happened in the past a number of times to me where artists from other countries I've spoken to and, invited them to do a project, of course, the first thing they say is, well, I want to come and work with Aboriginal artists, which has never happened, which is kind of the answer to the question maybe. But, I mean, my question is always, well, which Aboriginal artists did you want to work with? Have you got a relationship to the community? Do you understand these communities? Who's invited you from that community to engage with that story, or even visit that place? And I think that answer to that will determine it, really.
We've run out of time for this session. Do you have a question? No, okay. So, and in case any questions crop up, we also do have the roundup discussion. This is an invitation to please stay for tomorrow, since then we can actually have a bigger conversation also between the different participants and the audience, which is the end of the day tomorrow. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.